the Egyptian people and the Israelite people and the way they viewed him even back then. But by the time we get to Exodus chapter 1, let's look a little bit at how things changed. It says, and if you go on in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from this land. So what do you have going on there? What does it mean when it says there arose a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph? Didn't recognize what Joseph had done for the nation. Right, the other one had died, so you got some time that has passed. Is that common for us to sometimes forget our history? Yeah. And even if they didn't necessarily actually forget the history, enough time had passed to where they didn't experience it. They weren't close enough to it to where it didn't hold that same meaning and significance to them, right? So now what is the Pharaoh more focused on? Control. He's getting a little scared because God had been with this nation. They had started multiplying and growing. So he's a little bit afraid that, right over here in Goshen, our next door, you kind of sense that there's a little bit of segregation there, but these people are right there at their back door, and there's enough of them that if war breaks out, he's scared that they'll side with his enemies, and then they'll be in trouble. That's a good point. He's making decisions out of fear and insecurities, which is not a good way if you're a leader to make decisions. We don't tend to make the best when we're in that situation. So we're going to continue reading. Before we continue reading, let's go back to, just as a reminder again, Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. Just so we can keep this in mind as we continue to read this morning. And while I'm trying to get my cold fingers to work this morning on these pages, what's a little bit ironic about the Egyptians hating or finding shepherds detestable? Jesus called himself a good shepherd, and who else more immediate to what we're studying ends up being a shepherd? Moses. So it's that we'll talk about that more in coming weeks. Exodus 15, starting in verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So there goes back to Miss Beverly's 400 years answer. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. So who is God talking to right there? Abraham. That's, where he's making, one of the times that he makes that promise. So keep that in mind as we continue to look. So let's pick up in verse 11. Therefore they, as in the Egyptians, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So it's a big change here, right? From being shepherds to now, what are the Egyptians having to do? Yeah, so Pharaoh's first approach at trying to kind of control the population is to, just make things harder on them, make them eventually turn them into slaves, pressing them, thinking that, I guess if uh, he keeps his thumb on them hard enough that that'll influence them to maybe leave, or they won't multiply as rapidly. But we see God at work there, and they continue to multiply. So then Pharaoh, going back to Bronson's comment, his attitude is spread throughout the Egyptian people. So now we're seeing even the Egyptian people are starting to fear him. So that's kind of spreading throughout the nation, and Pharaoh's getting a little more and more desperate as we go on. So picking up in verse 15, then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom name was Shiphrah, and the other Puah, when you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. So now you've got Pharaoh going to the lengths of actual commanding murder, right? He's wanting these midwives to, if it's a male, to kill the male. But what do we know? What happens with these midwives? It says, the very next verse says they fear God, and they refuse to follow the king Pharaoh's command. And when the king brings them in verse 18 there, it says, he calls the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. There's some different thoughts on that. A lot of that kind of depends on exactly what year this took place, because you do have Egyptian history, which I didn't study real depth, but there's a lot of records that the Egyptians kept on the different pharaohs. What little bit I looked at it, it does get kind of confusing because a lot of them repeat the names, and the names are real similar and that sort of thing. But if you go on depending there, I guess there's kind of two main theories on the time period. One of them is around 1545 to 1526, and during that time, just I guess from Egyptian history, we kind of know that was Amenhotep, Amenhotep. Some people think it was him. The others think it was this Thutmose, Thutmos 1. Of course, there's going to be several of those that come along. And he was kind of reigning during, I think, from 1526 to 1512. So they feel like it's somewhere in that time period. Exactly when, we don't really know. It's kind of interesting, in these verses we just read, what names are we given? We're given the midwives' names, but who are we not given? Why do you think that is? Yeah, God, or whether it was God, the Holy Spirit directing Moses when Moses wrote this, or whether he left it up to Moses. Moses didn't want to show the Pharaoh enough respect to give a name, right? So it's kind of interesting that and ultimately God didn't want to give this Pharaoh any more credence, or because they worshipped idols, right? And so we're not told. But again, these midwives who were just too, quote, unimportant, in the grand scheme of things, seem like unimportant people, but we know in reality, these two midwives who, at this time didn't even have families, were more significant than and more important than whoever this Pharaoh was. And I think, to me, that's part of the honor that God is showing these midwives, is by mentioning their names, so that, standing here today, we know that what these two ladies' names were. I think that was part of God's plan to honor them when it really comes down to it. They did. A lot of them did. They set themselves up as gods and had the Egyptians worship them. So they did a lot of detestable things, which is why when you go back to Genesis 15, 13 through 14, God knew that, and he had a plan way back then to carry out judgment. And so I think we won't get too much into the plagues, if at all, depending on how much time we have. But I know a lot of times we look at that and think, man, that was harsh, some of the things that God did to those people, and bringing about the death of the firstborn. But, God is the ultimate what? He's the ultimate judge, so he has right to carry out punishment and judgment. And so that's really what you have going on there, is part of that judgment on that nation for how they've treated, his people. And then, as we're going to see, all of this, murdering, having the firstborn children killed and that sort of thing. That's part of their judgment. Right.
So God did it so that we'd understand, I'm tough, and what I say I'm going to do.
Yep, that's right.
I was looking at it as a choice. Give Pharaoh numerous times.
Right.
From the beginning, he did all the things. He was trying to.
Yeah, he
did everything from the beginning.
Right. He definitely had his opportunities to do right. That's for sure. Yeah. So, we're talking. It's interesting. We have this little Exodus chapter 1 intro. We're told a little bit about the history. We're told about these midwives. A couple of things here. One is, it kind of, as we continue to study about Moses, it's good to keep in mind this is the environment that Moses is about to be born into. So it's not a normal time. It's not a real peaceful time. The situation's pretty dire. So as we get into talking about Moses' birth and stuff, it's important to kind of keep that in mind, because that'll help us maybe understand or theorize about some of the personalities and the actions of Moses. But before we move on, God saw fit to mention these midwives. Let's look at just a few lessons we can learn from these midwives. One, I guess number one there would be hard times don't erase God's promises. What does that kind of mean? God's in charge, that's right. And if you think about, what it was like, we've got the advantage of hindsight, so to speak, and knowing the end of the story. But if you think about these Israelites during this time, these midwives during this time, they're right there in the middle of it. But if you look at it with Genesis 15, 13 through 14 in mind, this was part of God's promise, right? It was necessary for God's promise to come into being. So just because there's hard times, that doesn't negate or take away God's promises. Same thing for us. We go through hard times in our lives. We struggle because of sin and other things. But through all of that, that doesn't change God's promises to us. So it's something for us to remember. Number two there, and this is specifically, for the midwives, harsh treatment doesn't escape God's notice. Skip ahead to Exodus 3, verse 7, as we look at this thought. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. So again, you think about that verse, you think about Genesis 15, verse 13, where this was part of God's plan all along. He knew that the Israelites were going to Egypt, initially because that's where food was, that they were going to live there for 400 years, but that eventually they were going to end up becoming slaves to these Egyptians, and that he would have to step in. Hebrews 4, verse 13. There it says, and no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So what are those verses and that thought that harsh treatment doesn't escape God's notice? What is that? How do you feel and think about that thought? Can that be comforting to us? Should be. Yeah. Yeah, we're a little bit, I guess, spoiled here that we don't have the same persecutions and such as people in other places do now, and especially people in the past. So it's hard for us to kind of relate to that, but that definitely applies to that God notices those things. And even with us today, there may be short periods of our lives where we're mistreated or treated harshly, and even though it may not be enjoyable, and to these people it wasn't enjoyable, I'm sure. I mean, how do you think these midwives felt during this time? They very easily could have been killed. I mean, it was probably more strange that they weren't. I believe they were, I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that and see. I'm not sure if they were Israelites or Egyptians.
Well, it was worded whenever they told Pharaoh that, women don't.
Yeah, that does make you think that they were. That's a good point. So that's very possible, which goes to show you that. Right. Yep. It just goes to show you that even possibly there were some Egyptians that feared God and believed in God, because you had all these Israelites around, so they had to be aware of Israel's God and those sorts of things.
The other thing I was thinking about, it's amazing that Moses was brought up in Egyptian palace with them teaching about idols and all that. He had to have had some other, it looks like, for
Yeah.
him not to go in there.
Right. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And we're going to look. That's kind of the next thing we're looking at. We're not given a whole lot of detail about Moses' childhood and such, but there had to be some strong influences there, and his mother was there. Yep. So for at least a short amount of time, which again goes to show you what influence we can have on children at a young age. Yeah. 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 So, yeah, even just in a few short years, which we'll get, there's a lot of lessons to be learned there for sure when it comes to rearing children. Yeah. That's a good, it's kind of like our, what is the oath that doctors take? It's kind of, that's a good point. It went against their, there was a reason they got into that profession. So it went against whether they were, in this case, they seemed to be believers in God, but regardless, they had a conscience, and that, so it does go to show you that not everyone in this, all of the Egyptians felt the same way about this path forward. But again, Pharaoh had a lot of power, so he was able to, make a lot of things happen. But it's not as cut and a dry situation as sometimes we read it and think it is. Do you have something, Miss Judy? Okay, so it could be that they were Hebrews, and it's just that, again, if you go that avenue with it, what are we told? At this time, did these midwives have families? They didn't. So it could be that that's why they're, talking about when they say these Hebrew women are vigorous in birth, and give birth before we get there, they're kind of separating themselves from, Hebrew women that could have children, because it almost reads that these midwives weren't able to have children until, God intervenes because of their choices. So it's a chance that maybe they were Hebrew midwives. Yeah, that's a good point. And as he progresses, and we do that with sin a lot of times, I guess, in general, at first it was, let's make them slaves and just make life real hard on them, because then that keeps his hands a little clean, because he's just doing business, right? He's not attacking them personally. He's just making life, and sometimes we do that. If we want somebody to go away and leave us alone, we just make it hard on them and hope that maybe they'll go away. Then he progresses into being a little secretive about it, and he brings these midwives in and says, hey, some of the theories was it was more of even their own mothers wouldn't have known at this time. It would have looked like they were stillborn or something. These midwives are, one thought was maybe they were supposed to suffocate the child once it was born and then tell the mother, well, it didn't survive the birth process. So that's a good point. And then he gets so desperate that then he just makes a general command to the whole nation that, hey, throw them in the river. I mean, he got desperate, and now he's just not even trying to hide it. So that is a good thought there on the progression of his, how desperate and how committed he was to controlling this Israelite nation. The last lesson there, before we move on, is similar, but heavy tests don't eclipse God's concern. What's your thoughts on that comment? Heavy tests don't eclipse God's concern. You look at these midwives, and that was a pretty, like we've been talking about, they put themselves at risk, and God took notice. He noticed their obedience, and he rewarded them. So it's something for us to keep in mind in our lives when things get tough, and it might be easy for us to just go ahead and go with the flow. But God does notice when we do stand up and do what's right. And he will, if he doesn't reward us in this life, we'll be rewarded in the end, for sure. Faith over fear, that's right. Because they had to be scared, I would think, and they were, showed a lot of trust in God as well. Kind of a little bit like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their comment that, God can protect us, and He will, but if He chooses not to, we're still going to serve God and do what's right. And that's a really strong stance to take. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of faith and trust that, they would rather leave this earth than to disobey God. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And two, we see this with the Israelites and with Moses. God has a plan. He adjusts that plan and the path to that plan based on the behavior and reactions of the people, and probably does the same thing with us. We can't change God's plan and the end result, but sometimes we don't take the shortest route sometimes, as you'll see with the Israelites for sure. They really mess themselves up, and we can be like them a lot of times too. Well, let's go on. We won't completely cover it, but let's go ahead and just the next page there in your notes and we'll start talking about Moses' birth. And there at the first, we kind of already covered that. So there's, if you couldn't understand my pronunciation or spelling, that's the two possible people there at the top that scholars think were possibly the pharaohs at that time. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe one of those, if you go with the second one, if you remember last week, we kind of talked about, because who's significant in that, who becomes a big part of the story of Moses' birth, the daughter. So if you look at those two people, I believe it's the second one that we know from Egyptian history who his daughter was. And I've got it in my notes here somewhere. I wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway, but that daughter was basically would have made Moses an heir to the throne, so to speak, possibly, because of the line that it took. So that comes into play later on when you start thinking about what Moses gave up and walked away from. So there is a little bit of significance there. And as we've seen, some of these Egyptians too were, not all of them, I guess, had the same beliefs and approach to the Israelites as the Pharaoh we've been talking about in Exodus chapter 1, as far as being so harsh to the Israelites, which might explain Moses' adoption. But again, when you look at what we've been talking about, Exodus chapter 1, of the environment and the situation, and then you get into the birth of Moses, it's interesting that it played out the way that it did. And if you look Exodus or Acts chapter 7, when we talk about the birth of Moses, it's also somewhat paralleled, and there's a little bit more detail in Acts chapter 7 that sheds a little more light on things. If you look there at Acts chapter 7, verse 20, and actually if we back up to verse 17, and again this goes back to the Genesis chapter 15 we were looking at. But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. And what is that talking about, expose their infants specifically? Throwing them in the river so that they would perish. At this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. Right. Yeah, it was all kind of, ways that they would, not survive. And let's go ahead and look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 while we're there. It says there in verse 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and that they were not afraid of the king's edict. So, in going with that in Acts chapter 7, if you read that whole chapter, and we'll go back and forth to that, it'll lay out kind of what we're going to be looking at. We've kind of mentioned Moses' time in Egypt. It lays out that he's going to spend 40 years in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd, and then 40 years as leader of God's people. That we kind of mentioned that last week for those of you that were here. But we're going to see that even though Moses is kind of brought into the world in some extraordinary circumstances, and later on toward the end of this quarter we're going to talk about he leaves this earth in some extraordinary circumstances and had an extraordinary life. We're also going to look at the fact that he was human and that he did make mistakes. And so again, what kind of environment was he born into? Yeah. It is very turbulent. And again, as we saw in Hebrews there, what were his parents like? Yeah, we know they were tribe of Levi. They were godly people. They feared God. That we saw it there in both of those verses. In Acts, it actually says God saw that the child was beautiful. There's a lot of thoughts on what significance that carries and what that really means. Most folks feel like it's more than just a physical attribute, even though it does appear that the Hebrew word that I'm told that's used there suggests that Moses truly was a very attractive baby. He was very well formed and such, but the way it reads, it almost gives you kind of the sense that possibly his mother, maybe led by God and the Holy Spirit, felt that there's something special, about this child. We know God saw it at the very beginning that he was going to use. Why he chose, Moses' parents and why he chose Moses. He could have chose, any baby at that point, but regardless, that was God's plan and his choice, and the parents, right, they had it in their heart to go against the king's command and carry out this plan. So what was this plan? Yeah, made a basket. Initially they hid the child for how many months? 3 months. So, you think about trying to hide a baby for 3 months, cries. You know, we don't know exactly because we're not told a whole lot what went on. I mean, we know there were children being born during this time, and if they were, you know, a female, then they were okay to keep. So I guess that may have helped the situation a little bit. You know, we don't know if these Egyptians went through inspecting the Israelites' homes. We really don't know, but we also know how hard it is to keep secrets, and that would be a pretty big secret. So, I mean, if your neighbors knew, if, you know, people that didn't like you knew, I mean, it had to be a stressful time for them. And, you know, couldn't have been very easy, and which is why in Hebrews chapter 11 they're commended for having faith and hiding for these 3 months. But eventually those 3 months came to an end, and I guess they realized, well, something else had to be done. Well, that probably I hadn't really thought about it, but I'm sure midwives were involved with that as well. So that probably did come into play a little bit. Don't know if it was these same midwives or not, but we do know they feared God and went against Pharaoh already. So that is a possibility. And what about this plan, and who carries out and comes up with the plan? The mother. So it's interesting, you know, these first couple of chapters of Exodus, who do we see having more of an influence on Moses' life than anyone else? Mother, sister, the midwives came into play. Pharaoh's daughter is going to come into play. So you see women heavily involved in the beginning stories of Moses and his survival, which is very significant. In this plan that the mother carried out, we'll run out of time, so we'll pick up kind of there next week. So if you'll go ahead and read Exodus chapter 2, that's kind of where we'll be, because I don't want to rush through that. But be thinking about that plan that was carried out, and then we'll talk a little bit about his childhood, what little bit we know, and finish up those pages there. But thank you for your attention and your comments this morning.